What happens when the galaxy's most decorated military strategist encounters something that defies every tactical principle they've ever learned? When Supreme War Commander Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire, victor of 17 star system conquests, accepts what seems like a routine diplomatic visit to Earth's premier military academy, he expects to observe primitive human training methods. Instead, he discovers something so fundamentally disturbing about human nature that it will shake the very foundations of everything he believes about warfare, honor, and survival itself. This is the story of how one alien commander's world was turned upside down by witnessing the impossible. Humans who fight not despite their weakness, but because of it. What he learns in those hallowed halls will either save his empire or destroy everything he holds dear. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about the true meaning of strength. The diplomatic shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere with mechanical precision, its sleek Zephyrian design cutting through the morning clouds like a silver blade. Supreme War Commander Kethvar pressed his four-fingered hand against the viewport, studying the blue-green world below with the calculating gaze of someone who had conquered 17 star systems. His elongated skull, marked with the ritual scars of countless victories, reflected in the transparent aluminum as he observed this curious planet that had somehow earned galactic attention. Commander, his aide, Sub-Lieutenant Vextol, approached with measured steps, her own scars still fresh from their recent campaign in the Proxima sector. The human delegation awaits your arrival. Their military academy has prepared what they call a full honors ceremony for your inspection. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his species. The Terran Coalition had formally requested this diplomatic exchange 6 months ago, offering to showcase their military training methods in return for observer status during Zephyrian war games.
It was a laughably one-sided trade.
What could these soft, short-lived creatures possibly teach warriors who had dominated the galaxy for 3 millennia? Remind me again why High Command approved this waste of resources, Kethvar rumbled, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded fleets across star systems. Political necessity, sir. The humans have been persistent in their request for military cooperation. The Council deemed it easier to indulge them briefly than to continue refusing. Vextol consulted her datapad. The academy we're visiting is called West Point. According to their files, it's been training their officer class for over 2 centuries. 2 centuries. Kethvar had been alive longer than this entire institution had existed. The thought reinforced his conviction that this visit would be nothing more than an elaborate show for political theater. He'd observe their primitive methods, make appropriate diplomatic noises, and return with a report that would satisfy the Council while confirming what everyone already knew. Humans were a minor species playing at galactic relevance. The shuttle touched down on a landing pad that seemed almost comically oversized for their small craft. As the engines powered down, Kethvar adjusted his formal military regalia. The midnight blue uniform adorned with campaign ribbons that told the story of his conquests across known space. Each ribbon represented a world that had fallen before Zephyrian might. Populations that had learned to fear the sight of his fleets in their skies. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss, and Earth's atmosphere rushed in. Kethvar's enhanced respiratory system immediately analyzed the composition. Nitrogen, oxygen, trace gases, primitive but adequate. What struck him more than the chemical makeup was something else entirely. The air carried scents he couldn't identify, organic compounds that spoke of a world teeming with biological diversity. As he stepped onto the landing pad, the first thing that hit him was the sound. Not the mechanical humming of advanced technology or the controlled silence of military efficiency, but something far more chaotic. Voices, hundreds of them, calling out in unison. Human voices, raised in what their intelligence files identified as song. The honor guard that greeted them was a curious sight. Humans in crisp grey uniforms stood at attention with a precision that was almost acceptable by Zephyrian standards, though their physical presence was laughably inadequate. The tallest among them barely reached Kethvar's chest, and their unarmored forms looked like they would shatter if struck properly. Yet something in their bearing gave him pause. They stood with a certainty that seemed incongruous with their obvious physical limitations. Supreme War Commander Kethvar, announced the human leader, a grey-haired specimen whose uniform was heavy with what appeared to be decorative medals. I am General Patricia Morrison, Superintendent of the United States Military Academy. Welcome to West Point. Kethvar inclined his head in the minimal acknowledgement that protocol demanded. General Morrison, we appreciate your hospitality. The words felt strange on his mandibles. Hospitality was not a concept that featured prominently in Zephyrian military doctrine. The honor is entirely ours, Commander. We're eager to share our traditions with such a distinguished warrior. Morrison's smile seemed genuine. Though Kethvar couldn't fathom why she would be pleased to reveal military secrets to a potential adversary. If you'll follow me, the Corps of Cadets is assembled for review. They walked across what the humans called the plain, a large open area surrounded by imposing stone buildings. The architecture was solid but unimaginative, designed more for function than the intimidating aesthetic that Zephyrian structures employed. What caught Kethvar's attention was the gathering ahead of them, row upon row of young humans in identical grey uniforms, standing in perfect formation. 4,000 cadets, Morrison explained with evident pride. Each one selected from tens of thousands of applicants. They represent the best and brightest our species has to offer. Kethvar studied the assembled humans with professional interest. They were young, most appearing to be barely past adolescence by his species standards. Their faces showed the soft features of beings who had never known real hardship, never felt the weight of survival pressing down upon them. These were the elite? These children playing dress-up in military costumes? How long do they train here, he asked, genuinely curious about how long it took to forge even marginally competent officers from such unpromising material. 4 years, Morrison replied. They arrive as teenagers and graduate as second lieutenants, ready to lead soldiers in combat. 4 years. In Zephyrian military culture, it took 4 decades to reach basic combat competency. The idea that these creatures believed they could create officers in 4 years would have been amusing if it weren't so concerning. What kind of military relied on such inadequately trained leadership? As they approached the formation, the assembled cadets began to move. What followed defied Kethvar's expectations. Despite their obvious physical limitations, the humans moved with a precision that rivaled veteran Zephyrian units. Every step fell in perfect unison, every movement coordinated with mechanical accuracy. The sound of 4,000 feet striking the ground simultaneously created a rhythmic thunder that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Eyes right, came a command from somewhere in the formation, and 4,000 heads turned as one toward the reviewing party. The synchronization was flawless, the execution immediate and absolute. Kethvar found himself genuinely surprised. He had observed many military formations throughout his career, had reviewed the elite forces of a dozen conquered species, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The precision was remarkable, yes, but it was something else that caught his attention. Something he couldn't quite identify. Impressive synchronization, he admitted to Morrison. Your training methods appear adequate for achieving basic unit cohesion.
Morrison's smile widened.
Thank you, Commander. Though I suspect you'll find that coordination is just the beginning of what makes our cadets special. As they passed down the line of cadets, Kethvar studied their faces more closely. What he saw there challenged his assumptions. These weren't the soft, pampered children he had expected. Their eyes held something he recognized from his own mirror, the hard certainty of warriors who had been tested and had not broken. But how was that possible? Intelligence reports indicated that Earth had been at peace for decades. These cadets had never seen combat, never faced the crucible that forged true warriors. Tell me, General, he said, his voice carefully neutral. What conflicts have these cadets experienced? What battles have tested their resolve? Morrison paused for a moment, seeming to consider her answer carefully. None, in the conventional sense. But, Commander, you may find that humans have unique ways of discovering what they're made of, even in peacetime. The review continued with various demonstrations of human military capability. Kethvar watched cadets perform combat drills with weapons that seemed primitive by galactic standards, observed their training in tactics that appeared rudimentary compared to three-dimensional space combat, and listened to lectures on leadership principles that seemed overly concerned with abstract concepts like honor and duty. Everything he saw confirmed his initial assessment. Humans were a minor species, with delusions of military grandeur. Their equipment was adequate but unimpressive. Their tactics sound but limited, their physical capabilities laughable by galactic standards. Yet something nagged at him, a persistent feeling that he was missing something important. The feeling grew stronger during the formal dinner that evening. Surrounded by human officers and cadets, Kethvar found himself engaged in conversations that revealed surprising depth. These weren't the simple warriors he was accustomed to dealing with. They discussed philosophy alongside tactics, debated ethics as readily as they planned maneuvers, and seemed to view warfare as something more complex than the simple application of superior force. Tell me about your greatest military victory, asked a young cadet. A female named Sarah Chen, whose records indicated she stood first in her class academically. What made it significant to you personally? The question caught Kefar off guard. Military victories weren't personal. They were strategic achievements measured in conquered territory and subjugated populations. The concept of personal significance in warfare was foreign to his thinking. Victory is victory, he replied after a moment. Success is measured by objectives achieved and enemy forces neutralized. Chen nodded thoughtfully. But surely there's more to it than that. I mean, what drives you to excel? What makes the sacrifice worthwhile? Sacrifice, another word that seemed to carry more weight among humans than it did in Zephyrian culture. For his people, military service was simply what one did, a natural expression of their superiority over lesser species. The idea that sacrifice was involved implied that one had something valuable to give up, which seemed contrary to the obvious duty of serving one's empire. I serve the empire, Kethra said, offering the standard response. Personal considerations are irrelevant. But even as he spoke the words, he found himself wondering about the look in the young human's eyes. There was something there, a depth of commitment that seemed to go beyond mere duty. It was as if she was fighting for something he couldn't understand, defending something he couldn't see. The evening concluded with what the humans called a parade. By torchlight, the entire corps of cadets marched in formation while spectators watched from the surrounding buildings. The sight was undeniably impressive. 4,000 figures moving as one through the darkness, their synchronized steps echoing off the stone walls like distant thunder. But what struck Kethvar most powerfully was the sound that accompanied the march. The cadets were singing not the martial hymns of conquest that Zephyrian forces used, but something else entirely. The melody was haunting, complex, filled with harmonies that seemed to speak of loss and hope intertwined. "What are they singing?" he asked Morrison, who stood beside him on the reviewing platform. "The Corps," she replied. "It's our alma mater. Every cadet learns it, and most remember it for the rest of their lives." Kethvar listened to the lyrics as they drifted through the night air, trying to understand their meaning. The words spoke of duty and sacrifice, of bonds that transcended individual concerns, of commitment to something greater than oneself. But unlike Zephyrian war songs that celebrated dominance and superiority, this human song seemed to acknowledge weakness and mortality while choosing to fight anyway. As the last notes faded into silence and the cadets disappeared into their barracks, Kethvar found himself strangely unsettled. Everything he had observed confirmed that humans were physically inferior to virtually every other spacefaring species. Their technology was adequate but unremarkable, their tactics conventional, their training time ridiculously abbreviated. Yet something about what he had witnessed didn't fit his understanding of how military forces functioned. There was an intensity to human military culture that seemed disproportionate to their actual capabilities, a depth of commitment that exceeded what should have been rational for a species with so many obvious limitations. As he retired to his guest quarters that night, Kethvar made a mental note to observe more closely in the days ahead. Clearly, there were aspects of human military culture that weren't immediately apparent to external observers. Perhaps understanding these peculiarities would provide useful intelligence for future interactions with the Terran Coalition. What he didn't realize, as he lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the strange sounds of an alien world, was that his understanding of warfare itself was about to be fundamentally challenged. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shake his confidence in everything he thought he knew about the nature of military strength. The academy slept around him, but somewhere in the darkness, 4,000 human cadets dreamed dreams of a future where they would be called upon to defend something precious against forces they could barely imagine. And in that dreaming, they prepared themselves for a reality that even their instructors couldn't fully predict. A reality where the true test of a warrior wasn't strength or superiority, but the willingness to stand firm in the face of impossible odds. Dawn came early to West Point, announced not by the artificial chronometers Kethvar was accustomed to, but by the natural rising of Earth's single sun. The commander woke to unfamiliar sounds filtering through his window, not the mechanical humming of life support systems or the regulated announcements of ship operations, but something far more chaotic and organic. Voices calling to each other across courtyards, footsteps hurrying along stone pathways, the distant sound of human laughter. Laughter, in a military installation. The concept was so foreign to Kethvar's experience that he spent several minutes trying to determine if what he was hearing might be some form of distress signal. A soft chime announced the arrival of his escort for the day. Not Morrison this time, but a younger human officer whose uniform bore the insignia of a major. The man's bearing was crisp and professional, but there was something in his demeanor that differed from the rigid formality Kethvar expected from subordinate officers. "Good morning, Commander. I'm Major James Harrison, and I'll be your guide today. I hope you found your accommodation satisfactory." Kethvar studied the human's face, noting the genuine concern in his expression. In Zephyrian culture, a subordinate's primary obligation was to avoid bothering superiors with unnecessary concerns. The idea that this human actually cared about his comfort was puzzling. "Adequate," Kethvar replied, then found himself adding, "though I was surprised by the level of activity during what I assume were designated rest periods." Harrison's face brightened with what appeared to be amusement. "Ah, you've heard the cadets. Yes, they can be quite energetic, even during off-duty hours. Part of being young, I suppose. Today, I thought you might like to observe some of our classroom instruction. See how we develop their minds, as well as their bodies." Classroom instruction. Kethvar had reviewed the Academy's curriculum and found it surprisingly broad for a military institution. Beyond the expected courses in tactics, weapons, and military history, the humans somehow found time to teach their officer candidates literature, philosophy, ethics, and even artistic subjects. It seemed like a waste of precious training time. They walked across the campus as cadets hurried to their morning classes, and Kethvar found himself studying the interactions between these young humans. What he observed challenged his understanding of proper military discipline. While the cadets maintained appropriate military bearing when addressing officers, among themselves they displayed a camaraderie that seemed almost casual. He watched two cadets, both appearing to be in their final year based on their insignia, engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument about something called football rankings. The dispute was passionate, almost aggressive, yet neither seemed concerned about the other's different opinion. In Zephyrian culture, such disagreement between military personnel of equal rank would require formal resolution through combat or arbitration. "They seem remarkably informal," Kethvar observed. Harrison followed his gaze and chuckled. That would be Cadets Williams and Rodriguez. They've been having that same argument about football teams for 3 years now. They're also roommates and best friends. When Williams broke his leg during a training exercise last semester, Rodriguez carried him 6 miles to the medical station. The idea of carrying a wounded comrade 6 miles was impressive by any military standard, but the context confused Kethvar. They maintained friendship despite fundamental disagreements? "Commander, with respect, disagreement isn't the same as conflict. These cadets will spend their careers making life and death decisions. Learning to work with people who think differently isn't just useful, it's essential." They entered the first classroom where Kethvar expected to observe instruction in tactics or weapon systems. Instead, he found himself in what appeared to be a philosophy course. The instructor, a silver-haired human with the bearing of a veteran officer, was leading a discussion about something called just war theory. "Miss Patterson," the instructor was saying, "you argued last week that military action is justified only in direct response to aggression. How do you reconcile that position with the concept of preemptive defense?" The cadet in question, a slight young woman who would have been considered physically inadequate for military service by any Zephyrian standard, stood and responded with confidence. "Sir, I believe the key distinction lies in the certainty and immediacy of the threat. Preemptive action based on speculation or fear undermines the moral foundation that separates legitimate military force from mere aggression." Kethvar found himself leaning forward, intrigued despite himself. The cadet was discussing concepts that most Zephyrian officers never considered. In his culture, military action was justified by superior force and strategic advantage. The idea that moral considerations should limit military options was foreign to his thinking. Another cadet raised his hand. "But Patterson, that position assumes we can always wait for perfect certainty. What if waiting means accepting casualties that could have been prevented?" "Then we accept those casualties," Patterson replied without hesitation. "Because the alternative is becoming the very thing we claim to fight against." The discussion continued for another hour, with cadets debating complex ethical scenarios that had no clear answers. Kethvar watched with growing fascination as these young humans grappled with questions that would never arise in Zephyrian military planning. They weren't just learning to fight, they were learning when fighting was justified, when it was necessary, and when it should be avoided entirely. "Interesting curriculum," he commented to Harrison as they left the classroom, "though I question the practical value of such abstract discussions." Harrison paused at that, turning to face the alien commander directly. "Commander, may I ask you something?" In your military career, have you ever been in a situation where your orders conflicted with your personal judgment about what was right? The question caught Kethvar off guard. Orders were orders, personal judgment was irrelevant. The idea that they might conflict suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of military hierarchy. Orders are issued by superior authority based on strategic considerations beyond the scope of individual perspective, he replied carefully. Personal judgment is not a factor. But what if those strategic considerations were wrong? What if following orders would cause unnecessary suffering or achieve objectives that weren't worth the cost? Kethvar stared at the human major, trying to process what he was suggesting. You train your officers to question orders? We train them to think, Harrison replied simply. To consider the moral implications of their actions and to take responsibility for the consequences. Yes, that sometimes means questioning orders. It also means being prepared to follow orders they disagree with when the situation demands it, but only after they understand why. They moved to their next stop, a classroom where cadets were studying military history. But this wasn't the straightforward recounting of campaigns and battles that Kethvar expected. Instead, the instructor was leading an analysis of military failures, examining not just what went wrong tactically, but why leaders made the decisions they did, and how different choices might have led to different outcomes. Cadet Thompson, the instructor called on a young man near the back of the room. What do you think was the primary factor in Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo? Thompson considered the question carefully before responding. Sir, I believe it was overconfidence based on past success. Napoleon had won so many battles using similar tactics that he failed to adapt when facing a different kind of enemy who had learned from his previous victories. Interesting perspective. Do you see any parallels to modern military thinking? Yes, sir. Any military force that becomes too convinced of its own superiority risks making the same mistake. Success can breed the kind of arrogance that leads to failure when facing unexpected challenges. Kethvar felt an uncomfortable stirring at those words. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 17 star systems using the same basic approach, overwhelming technological and numerical superiority applied with ruthless efficiency. They had never needed to adapt because they had never faced serious resistance. But these human cadets were being taught to expect adaptation, to anticipate that their enemies would learn and change. The lesson continued with an examination of David and Goliath, apparently a story from ancient human literature about a small warrior defeating a much larger opponent through clever tactics and determination. The instructor used it to illustrate how technological or numerical advantages could be overcome through superior strategy and willingness to accept casualties. The lesson here, the instructor concluded, isn't that the underdog always wins. It's that victory isn't predetermined by apparent advantages. The side that's willing to adapt, to sacrifice, and to keep fighting despite overwhelming odds often finds ways to succeed that nobody anticipated. After the class, Harrison led Kethvar to observe physical training. Here, finally, was something the Zephyrian commander felt qualified to evaluate. Physical conditioning was a universal military requirement, and he expected to see the kind of basic fitness programs that most species employed. What he observed instead challenged his assumptions once again. The cadets were divided into small groups, each working on different exercises designed not just to build strength and endurance, but to test their mental resilience under physical stress. He watched one group struggling through an obstacle course that seemed designed to be nearly impossible. Barriers too high to climb easily, walls too smooth to scale without help, gaps too wide to jump safely. The remarkable thing wasn't that many cadets failed to complete the course. It was that those who failed immediately got back up and tried again. And again, and again. He watched one young cadet, a small female who seemed particularly unsuited to the physical demands, attempt a rope climb 7 times before succeeding. Each failure was followed immediately by another attempt, with no sign of surrender or discouragement. Why don't they quit? He asked Harrison, genuinely puzzled. Surely after the 3rd or 4th failure, continued attempts become counterproductive. Because quitting isn't an option. Harrison replied matter-of-factly. These cadets are learning that failure is temporary unless you make it permanent by giving up. In combat, the difference between success and failure often comes down to who's willing to keep trying when everything seems hopeless. Kethvar watched another group engaged in what appeared to be a team exercise. They were tasked with moving a heavy object across a series of obstacles using only basic tools and their own physical capabilities. What fascinated him was how they approached the problem. Instead of competing with each other for leadership, they seemed to naturally distribute responsibilities based on individual strengths and expertise. He watched as a cadet who appeared to be one of the weakest physically took charge of the planning, while the strongest cadets positioned themselves to execute the most demanding parts of the plan. When their initial approach failed, they regrouped immediately and tried a different strategy. When that failed too, they tried another. "How many attempts are they permitted?" Kethvar asked. "As many as it takes," Harrison replied. "The exercise ends when they succeed, or when time runs out. Most groups succeed eventually, but not always on the first day, or the second." The record for this particular exercise is 8 days of continuous attempts. 8 days. These humans would spend 8 days on a single training exercise rather than accept failure. The determination was impressive, but it also seemed inefficient. Surely there were better ways to allocate training resources than allowing cadets to spend unlimited time on individual challenges. Yet as he watched the current group finally achieve success on their 6th attempt, celebrating their victory with obvious joy and mutual congratulation, Kethvar began to understand something important. They weren't just learning to complete the exercise. They were learning that persistence could overcome obstacles that initially seemed insurmountable. They were developing an unshakable belief that solutions existed for every problem if they were willing to keep searching for them. The afternoon brought observation of military tactics classes, where cadets studied scenarios that seemed designed to place them at severe disadvantages. Unlike Zephyrian training, which focused on leveraging superior resources to achieve victory, human military education seemed obsessed with finding ways to win when victory appeared impossible. Kethvar watched cadets plan defensive strategies for outnumbered forces, develop supply lines for isolated units, and devise communication protocols for situations where normal command structures had been disrupted. Every scenario seemed to assume that things would go wrong, that forces would be cut off from support, that commanders would have to make critical decisions with insufficient information and inadequate resources. "Your training scenarios seemed unrealistically pessimistic," he observed to Harrison during a break between classes. "Surely proper planning and adequate resources would prevent most of these situations from arising." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Commander, in your military experience, how often do operations proceed exactly as planned?" Kethvar considered the question. In Zephyrian campaigns, overwhelming superiority usually ensured that operations proceeded smoothly. When problems arose, they were typically resolved through the application of additional force. Properly planned operations with adequate resources rarely encounter insurmountable difficulties, he replied. "But what about when resources aren't adequate? What about when planning can't account for every variable? What about when the enemy does something unexpected?" The questions were troubling because they implied scenarios Kethvar had never seriously considered. The Zephyrian Empire's military doctrine was based on ensuring that resources were always adequate and that enemies never had opportunities to do anything truly unexpected. "We ensure adequate resources through proper planning and overwhelming force," he said finally. Harrison nodded slowly. "And that's an excellent approach when it's possible. But Commander, what happens to a military force that's never learned to fight without overwhelming advantages? What happens when they encounter an enemy who can't be overwhelmed?" The question hung in the air between them as they walked toward their final observation of the day, a capstone exercise where senior cadets were tasked with developing comprehensive strategies for complex military scenarios. As Kethvar listened to these young humans debate approaches to problems that had no perfect solutions, he found himself confronted with a disturbing realization. These cadets were being trained for a kind of warfare he had never considered. Warfare where victory wasn't guaranteed by superior force, where commanders couldn't rely on technological advantages, where success depended on factors that couldn't be calculated or planned for in advance. They were being trained to fight wars they couldn't win through conventional means, and judging by their intensity and commitment, they believed such wars were not just possible but probable. As evening fell and the day's observations came to an end, Kethvar found himself deeply unsettled. Everything he had seen challenged fundamental assumptions about military training and warfare itself. These humans weren't just preparing to fight. They were preparing to fight when fighting seemed pointless, to persist when persistence seemed futile, to sacrifice everything for objectives that might not be achievable. It was either the most admirable dedication he had ever witnessed or the most dangerous delusion, and he was beginning to suspect that the distinction might not matter as much as he had originally thought. The third day brought an unexpected change in schedule. Instead of the formal classroom observations Kethvar had grown accustomed to, Major Harrison informed him that the cadets would be participating in something called Beast Barracks, an intensive field exercise designed to test not just their military skills, but their character under extreme stress. "I should warn you, Commander," Harrison said as they made their way to the assembly area before dawn. This isn't going to be like the structured exercises you've observed so far. Beast is designed to push cadets beyond their breaking point and see what they do when they get there. Kethvar found the terminology curious. In Zephyrian culture, reaching one's breaking point was considered a failure to be avoided through proper conditioning and preparation. The idea that humans would deliberately push their personnel to such extremes seemed counterproductive. What purpose does breaking your personnel serve? He asked. Harrison paused, clearly considering how to explain something that seemed obvious to him but foreign to his alien observer. Because in real combat, breaking points aren't optional, Commander. They happen whether you're prepared for them or not. The question is whether your soldiers know what to do when they reach that moment, whether they collapse or discover they're stronger than they thought. They arrived at the assembly area as the first grey hints of dawn were appearing on the horizon. 400 first-year cadets stood in formation, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and apprehension. These were the newest members of the Corps, barely 2 months into their 4-year program. They looked impossibly young to Kethar's eyes, like children playing at being soldiers. The exercise began with what seemed like a simple march. The cadets were divided into companies of 40 and given a basic mission. Reach a designated checkpoint 12 miles away within a specified time limit while carrying full equipment loads. It seemed straightforward enough, though Kethvar noted that the time limit was aggressive even for experienced troops. What made the exercise remarkable wasn't the physical challenge, but what happened when individuals began to struggle. Kethvar had expected to observe a competitive environment, where stronger cadets would naturally outpace weaker ones, leaving the latter to fail and be eliminated from the program. Instead, he witnessed something entirely different. When Cadet Martinez, a small, slight young woman who was clearly struggling with the weight of her pack after the first few miles, began to fall behind, her company didn't abandon her. Instead, other cadets began redistributing her load among themselves, taking on additional weight to ensure she could maintain the pace. Inefficient, Kethvar commented to Harrison, who was accompanying him in a vehicle alongside the marching cadets. The strong are being weakened to accommodate the limitations of the weak. Are they? Harrison asked. Or are they learning that a unit's effectiveness depends on every member reaching the objective? Kethvar watched as the redistribution of weight continued throughout the march. The strongest cadets were now carrying significantly more than their original loads, while the weakest were carrying the minimum necessary to maintain the appearance of participating. From a purely logical standpoint, it made no sense. The strong were being handicapped to compensate for the inadequacies of the weak. But as the miles passed and the physical stress increased, something unexpected began to happen. The cadets who were struggling physically began contributing in other ways. Martinez, freed from the overwhelming burden of her pack, became the company's navigator, her superior map-reading skills keeping them on the most efficient route. Thompson, a slight cadet who had given up most of his ammunition to stronger companions, served as the unit's communications specialist, maintaining contact with other companies and coordinating movement. By the time they reached the checkpoint, the entire company had succeeded, but not in the way Kethvar had anticipated. Instead of the strongest cadets succeeding and the weakest failing, they had all succeeded together, each contributing according to their abilities, while the group compensated for individual limitations. Interesting adaptation, he admitted to Harrison, though I question whether this prepares them for situations where such cooperation isn't possible. Harrison's response was to direct Kethvar's attention to the next phase of the exercise. The companies were now being split up and regrouped randomly, separating the cadets who had just learned to work together and forcing them to quickly integrate with strangers. Their new mission was more complex. Establish defensive positions around a simulated forward operating base while under intermittent enemy fire from training staff using blank ammunition and simulation weapons. What followed was chaos. The randomly assembled groups had none of the cohesion they had developed during the march. Communication broke down, coordination failed, and several groups became completely disorganized under the simulated attack. Kethvar watched cadets diving for cover, shouting contradictory orders, and generally performing exactly as poorly as he would have expected from barely trained personnel under stress. But then something remarkable began to happen. Instead of remaining paralyzed by the chaos, individual cadets began to take initiative. Without formal leadership designation or clear command structure, they started organizing small groups, establishing communication protocols, and coordinating defensive actions. When the designated leader of one group was killed by simulated enemy fire, another cadet immediately stepped into the role without waiting for orders or authorization. Kethvar watched a young cadet named Johnson, who had shown no particular leadership ability during the march, rally a group of confused strangers, and establish an effective defensive perimeter within minutes of taking charge. When asked later how he knew what to do, Johnson simply replied, "Someone had to do it, sir." The exercise continued for 18 hours, with the stress and complexity gradually increasing. Equipment failed, communications were jammed, supply lines were cut, and casualties mounted. By any conventional military standard, the exercise should have resulted in complete mission failure. The cadets were exhausted, confused, and operating with degraded capabilities, yet somehow they kept functioning. When conventional tactics failed, they improvised new ones. When standard equipment broke down, they found creative alternatives. When formal command structures were disrupted, informal leadership emerged. Most remarkably, when individual cadets reached their apparent breaking points and seemed ready to collapse, others stepped forward to support them, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. HFY observed one particularly telling moment during the exercise's most intense phase. Cadet Williams, who had been performing admirably throughout the day, suddenly broke down completely. The stress, exhaustion, and constant pressure had finally overwhelmed his psychological defenses, and he collapsed into what appeared to be complete emotional breakdown. In Zephyrian culture, such a failure would have resulted in immediate removal from military service and significant personal shame. But the human response was entirely different. Instead of abandoning Williams or treating him as a liability, his fellow cadets surrounded him protectively while continuing to execute their mission. One cadet, Rodriguez, the same young man who had argued about football rankings days earlier, knelt beside Williams and spoke quietly to him while maintaining security watch. Another cadet took over Williams's responsibilities without being asked, ensuring that the unit's capability wasn't compromised. Most remarkably, within 20 minutes Williams had recovered enough to resume his duties. He was clearly still shaken and operating below his normal capability, but he was functioning. When HFY later asked Rodriguez what he had said to help Williams recover, the cadet's response was simple. "I told him he wasn't alone, sir. That we needed him, and we weren't going anywhere without him." The concept was foreign to HFY's experience. In Zephyrian military culture, individual strength was paramount. Warriors who couldn't handle stress were eliminated from service to prevent them from weakening the force. The idea of deliberately maintaining weaker elements and supporting them through their failures seemed contrary to military efficiency. Yet as the exercise concluded, and HFY observed the debriefing sessions, he began to understand something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness. These cadets hadn't succeeded despite their individual failures. They had succeeded because of how they handled those failures. During the debriefing, instructors didn't just focus on what had gone right or wrong tactically. They spent equal time examining how the cadets had responded to stress, how they had supported each other through difficult moments, and what they had learned about their own capabilities and limitations. "Williams," one instructor said during the session, "tell us about your breakdown during the final assault phase." Instead of shame or defensive explanations, Williams responded with remarkable honesty. "Sir, I realized I had been trying to be perfect instead of trying to be helpful. When I focused on not failing, I became so afraid of making mistakes that I couldn't function. When Rodriguez reminded me that the mission was bigger than my personal performance, I was able to focus on doing my job instead of worrying about doing it perfectly." The instructor nodded approvingly. "And what will you do differently next time?" "Trust my team more, sir. And remember that asking for help isn't the same as failing." HFY found himself deeply troubled by the exchange. These humans were being taught that vulnerability was acceptable, that admitting weakness was part of strength, that individual failure didn't necessarily lead to mission failure. Every principle he had been trained to value seemed to be turned upside down. That evening, he sat in his quarters struggling to process what he had witnessed. He reached for his communication device to file his daily report to High Command, but found himself uncertain how to characterize what he was observing. By every metric he had been trained to use, human military capabilities were inferior to Zephyrian standards. Their individual personnel were physically weaker, their training period was absurdly short, their equipment was adequate but unremarkable, and their tactics were conventional. Yet there was something else, something that didn't fit into any of the categories he had been taught to evaluate. These humans possessed a psychological resilience that seemed to transcend their individual capabilities. They had developed systems for turning individual weakness into collective strength, for transforming failure into learning opportunities, for maintaining functionality even when conventional military logic said they should have collapsed. A soft chime announced a visitor at his door. When he opened it, he found Cadet Sarah Chen, the same young woman who had questioned him about personal significance in warfare during his first evening at the academy. "Commander," she said, standing at respectful attention, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Major Harrison said you might be interested in attending our evening discussion group. Discussion group? Yes, sir. A few of us get together most evenings to talk about what we're learning, not just in classes, but from our experiences here. Tonight we're discussing leadership under stress, and given what happened during today's exercise, I thought you might find our perspectives interesting. Kethvar was about to decline. He needed time to process what he had observed and prepare his report. But something in the cadet's demeanor stopped him. There was a maturity in her bearing that seemed incongruous with her obvious youth. A depth of thoughtfulness that suggested these discussion groups might be more than casual social gatherings. Very well, he said. Lead the way. The discussion group met in a small common room in one of the dormitories. About 20 cadets had assembled informally, sitting on chairs, couches, and even the floor. What struck Kethvar immediately was the diversity of the group, not just in terms of physical appearance, but in personality and bearing. He recognized cadets who had performed exceptionally during the day's exercise, alongside others who had struggled significantly. We were just talking about today's beast exercise, Chen explained as they found seats. Specifically, about the difference between individual performance and team effectiveness. The discussion that followed revealed a level of self-reflection and analytical thinking that surprised Kethvar. These cadets weren't just rehashing the day's events. They were examining the deeper implications of what they had experienced and learned. I think I learned more from failing than from succeeding, admitted Cadet Thompson, the slight young man who had struggled with the physical demands of the march. When I couldn't carry my full load, I had to find other ways to contribute. That forced me to think about what leadership really means. But doesn't that create a dangerous precedent? Challenged another cadet. If we accommodate weakness, doesn't that encourage people to be weak? Chen shook her head. There's a difference between accommodating weakness and leveraging different strengths. Thompson couldn't carry as much weight as some of us, but his navigation skills kept us on track when others would have gotten lost. Which was more valuable to the mission? The debate continued for over an hour, with cadets examining questions that went to the heart of military philosophy. How do you maintain standards while recognizing individual differences? When does supporting struggling team members strengthen the unit, and when does it weaken it? How do you prepare for situations where conventional approaches won't work? What fascinated Kethvar was not just the sophistication of their thinking, but their willingness to question fundamental assumptions. These cadets weren't simply accepting what they were taught. They were actively engaging with complex ideas and developing their own understanding of what effective leadership meant. As the discussion wound down and cadets began returning to their rooms, Chen approached Kethvar with a question that would haunt him for the remainder of his visit. Commander, you've observed our training for several days now. What do you think is the most important quality for a military leader to possess? Kethvar considered the question carefully. In Zephyrian culture, the answer was obvious. Superior capability in all relevant areas. Intelligence, physical prowess, tactical knowledge, and the ability to dominate subordinates and enemies alike. But, as he looked at this young human female who clearly possessed several of those qualities despite her species' obvious limitations, he found himself uncertain of his answer for the first time in decades. I am still evaluating your methods, he said finally. Perhaps you should ask me again in a few days. Chen smiled. A genuinely warm expression that seemed to acknowledge both his uncertainty and his willingness to keep learning. I will, sir. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Kethvar walked back to his quarters, he realized that his entire understanding of military effectiveness was being challenged in ways he hadn't anticipated. These humans were forcing him to confront questions he had never thought to ask, to examine assumptions he had never questioned. And despite his growing unease about where those questions might lead, he found himself looking forward to continuing the exploration. The fourth day began with an emergency that would forever change Kethvar's understanding of human nature. He was awakened before dawn by urgent voices in the corridor outside his quarters, speaking in the rapid, clipped tones that indicated genuine crisis rather than training exercise. Major Harrison appeared at his door moments later, his face grim. Commander, I apologize for the disturbance, but we have a situation. One of our cadets has gone missing during a solo navigation exercise in the mountains. We're organizing a search and rescue operation. Missing. In Zephyrian culture, military personnel who became lost during training exercises were presumed to have failed in their fundamental duty to maintain unit cohesion and situational awareness. While efforts would be made to recover them, such incidents were typically treated as disciplinary matters requiring investigation and punishment. What are the circumstances? Kethvar asked, quickly donning his uniform. Cadet Martinez, you observed her during the march yesterday, was conducting a solo land navigation exercise in the mountains west of the academy. She was due to return last night but never reached her final checkpoint. Her emergency beacon isn't responding, and weather conditions in the area are deteriorating rapidly.
As they walked briskly toward the assembly area, Harrison continued briefing him on the situation.
The missing cadet had been following a designated route through challenging terrain as part of her advanced training. Radio contact had been lost approximately 18 hours earlier, and a severe winter storm was moving into the search area. What Kethvar encountered at the assembly area defied his expectations. Instead of a small, professional search team, the logical response to a single missing person, he found hundreds of cadets volunteering for the rescue operation. They stood in formation despite the early hour, already equipped with cold weather gear and emergency supplies, waiting for assignments. This seems like an excessive response to one missing person, he observed to Harrison. Surely a small team of professionals would be more efficient. Harrison's response was sharp, carrying an edge of emotion that surprised the alien commander. Commander, with respect, we don't leave people behind. Ever. Martinez is one of ours and we'll bring her home. The organization of the search operation revealed aspects of human military culture that Kethvar had never encountered. Instead of a hierarchical command structure directing operations from above, he watched as cadets at every level contributed to planning and coordination. Senior cadets with wilderness experience took charge of route planning, while others with medical training prepared emergency response protocols. Most remarkably, the operation included cadets who had struggled during previous exercises. Thompson, the slight cadet who had required assistance with his pack during the march, volunteered for one of the most demanding search sectors. Williams, who had experienced emotional breakdown just the day before, insisted on joining a technical climbing team despite obvious fatigue. Are you certain these personnel are ready for such demanding operations? Kethvar asked as he watched Williams checking climbing equipment with hands that still showed slight tremors from his previous day's stress. No, Harrison replied honestly, but they're ready to try. And sometimes that's what matters most. The search teams deployed before full daylight, spreading across dozens of square miles of mountainous terrain. Kethvar accompanied the command post, monitoring radio communications and observing the coordination of multiple teams in challenging conditions. What he heard over the radio channels challenged every assumption he had made about human military capabilities. The teams operated with a level of coordination and mutual support that exceeded anything he had observed in formal training exercises. When Team Alpha encountered technical climbing challenges beyond their expertise, Team Bravo immediately diverted to provide assistance despite the delay to their own search sector. When Team Charlie's communications equipment failed in the deteriorating weather, Team Delta established relay positions to maintain contact. Most significantly, the teams adapted continuously to changing conditions without waiting for orders from the command post. When the planned search grid became impractical due to weather, team leaders modified their routes and communicated changes to adjacent teams. When equipment failures threatened to compromise safety, teams immediately implemented alternative protocols. Your communications discipline is remarkable, Kethvar commented to Harrison after listening to several hours of radio traffic. The teams are maintaining coordination despite significant autonomy. That's because they understand the mission, Harrison replied. They know why they're here and what they're trying to accomplish. We don't need to micromanage people who are committed to the objective. As the hours passed and the weather continued to deteriorate, the search operation began to encounter serious challenges. Several teams reported equipment problems, and 2 cadets required evacuation due to exposure-related injuries. By any logical assessment, the operation was becoming more dangerous than the original emergency that had prompted it. Yet instead of scaling back the search or waiting for better conditions, the response intensified. Additional volunteers appeared at the command post throughout the day, and teams in the field pushed deeper into hazardous terrain despite obvious risks to their own safety. This is becoming counterproductive, Kethvar finally said to Harrison. You're risking dozens of personnel to recover one missing individual. The logical response would be to suspend operations until conditions improve. Harrison turned to face him, and for the first time since Kethvar's arrival, the Major's diplomatic courtesy was replaced by something harder and more direct. Commander, I need you to understand something about how we operate. We don't make cost-benefit calculations about people's lives. We don't write off personnel because rescuing them is inconvenient or dangerous. When one of our people is in trouble, we go get them. Period. That's not negotiable. The alien commander found himself struggling with concepts that seemed to defy military logic. In Zephyrian culture, Individual lives were valuable only insofar as they contributed to overall military effectiveness. Risking many to save one was a fundamental violation of strategic thinking. But surely there must be limits, he pressed. What if the risk to rescue forces exceeds the value of the recovery? Then we accept the risk, Harrison replied without hesitation. Because the alternative is telling every other cadet that their lives are expendable under certain circumstances. And once you do that, you've destroyed the trust that makes everything else possible. The breakthrough came late in the afternoon when Team Echo reported finding Martinez's equipment cache near a cliff face in one of the most remote search sectors. The cache suggested she had been attempting to establish an emergency shelter when she had fallen or become trapped in the deteriorating conditions. What followed was a technical rescue operation that pushed human capabilities to their limits. The terrain was nearly inaccessible. The weather was continuing to worsen, and Martinez's exact location remained unknown. Yet instead of waiting for professional rescue specialists or better conditions, the cadets immediately began adapting their search techniques to the specific challenges. Cathvar watched through binoculars as Williams, the same cadet who had broken down emotionally just days before, volunteered to rappel down the cliff face to search for Martinez. When asked why he was willing to take such a risk, his response was simple: because she would do it for me. The rescue itself, when it finally came, revealed the full extent of human determination. Martinez was found unconscious in a crevice 50 feet below the cliff edge, suffering from exposure and a broken leg. Retrieving her required a complex operation involving multiple rope systems, medical stabilization in extremely difficult conditions, and coordination between teams in different locations. The operation took 6 hours to complete safely. By the time Martinez was finally lifted to the top of the cliff and evacuated to medical care, over 200 cadets had participated directly in her rescue, and dozens more had provided support from the command post. As they watched the medical evacuation helicopter disappearing toward the academy, Cathvar found himself profoundly shaken by what he had witnessed. The human response to the emergency had been entirely contrary to logical military doctrine, yet it had succeeded despite overwhelming challenges. "She's going to be fine," Harrison said, interpreting Cathvar's silence as concern for the injured cadet. "Hypothermia, broken legs, some cuts and bruises, but she'll make a full recovery. She'll probably be back to full duty within a few weeks." "That's not what concerns me," Cathvar replied slowly. "What concerns me is what I observed today. Your people willingly risked their lives for one individual who had failed in her basic duty to maintain safety during a training exercise. You committed enormous resources and accepted significant risk for minimal strategic gain. By any rational analysis, today's operation was a costly failure." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider his response carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Cathvar had not heard before. "Commander, I think you're missing something fundamental about what happened here today. Yes, Martinez made a mistake that put her in danger. Yes, rescuing her was expensive and risky. But that's not what today was really about." "Then what was it about?" "It was about demonstrating to every cadet at this academy that they matter, that their lives have value that can't be calculated in strategic terms, that no matter what happens, no matter how bad things get, we will come for them. We will not abandon them. We will not write them off. We will not leave them behind." Harrison paused, looking out over the mountains where the search operation had unfolded. "You see today as a waste of resources, Commander. I see it as an investment in something you can't put on a balance sheet, the absolute trust that makes everything else we do possible. Every cadet who participated in today's rescue now knows beyond any doubt that their teammates will risk everything to bring them home. How do you calculate the strategic value of that certainty?" That evening, Cathvar attended another informal discussion group, but this time the atmosphere was different. The cadets who gathered were exhausted from the day's rescue operation, many still showing signs of exposure to harsh conditions. Yet their mood was not one of fatigue or frustration, but of quiet satisfaction. "I learned something about myself today," admitted Cadet Thompson, who had volunteered for one of the most challenging search sectors despite his obvious physical limitations. "I always thought courage meant not being afraid. Today I realized it means being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." "What scared you most?" asked Chen, who had served as a communications relay during the operation. "That we might not find her in time," Thompson replied without hesitation. "That all our training and preparation might not be enough when it really mattered. That I might let everyone down when they were counting on me." "But you didn't let anyone down," observed Williams, who had performed the technical cliff rescue. None of us did. We all did our jobs, and we brought Martinez home. Chen nodded thoughtfully. I think that's what today was really about. Not just rescuing Martinez, but discovering that we could do what needed to be done when it really mattered. That all the training and preparation actually works when the stakes are real. Kethvar listened to the discussion with growing unease. These young humans had participated in an operation that violated every principle of efficient military doctrine, yet they spoke of it as a validation of their training and their character. They had risked everything for minimal strategic gain, yet they considered it a success that had strengthened rather than weakened their unit. When the discussion turned to broader questions about military service and sacrifice, Kethvar found himself confronted with perspectives that challenged his fundamental worldview. What do you think is the most important thing we learned here? Chen asked the group. That we can trust each other, replied Martinez, who had been released from the medical facility with her leg in a cast. Her presence at the discussion despite her recent ordeal surprised Kethvar, almost as much as her perspective on the day's events. Even when everything goes wrong, added Williams, even when we make mistakes or fail in our individual responsibilities, we're not alone. The team will come for us. But doesn't that create moral hazard? Challenged another cadet. If people know they'll be rescued regardless of their failures, doesn't that encourage carelessness? Martinez shook her head emphatically. It's the opposite. Knowing that other people are willing to risk everything for you makes you want to be worthy of that sacrifice. It makes you more careful, not less, because you realize your safety affects everyone around you. The discussion continued late into the evening, touching on concepts that seemed to transcend military doctrine entirely. These cadets were grappling with questions about loyalty, sacrifice, mutual responsibility, and the relationship between individual and collective welfare in ways that had no parallel in Kethvar's experience. As he walked back to his quarters, the alien commander found himself confronted with an uncomfortable realization. Everything he had witnessed during his time at the academy, the philosophical discussions, the emphasis on supporting struggling team members, the willingness to sacrifice efficiency for principles, had been preparation for the kind of response he had observed during the rescue operation. These humans weren't just training to fight wars, they were training to maintain their humanity while fighting wars. They were developing systems and values that would allow them to preserve what they were fighting for, even in the midst of violence and destruction. It was either the most admirable dedication to principle he had ever encountered, or the most dangerous idealistic delusion. And as he prepared his daily report for High Command, Kethvar realized he was no longer certain which interpretation was correct. What terrified him most was the growing suspicion that the distinction might not matter as much as he had always believed. The final day of Kethvar's visit began with an unexpected summons. Instead of the scheduled observations of advanced tactical exercises, he was informed that the superintendent herself, General Morrison, had requested a private meeting. As he made his way to her office in the administration building, he found himself dreading what had become an inevitable moment of reckoning. Morrison's office was unlike any military command center he had ever seen. While it contained the expected maps, communications equipment, and operational displays, it was also filled with books, artwork created by cadets, and photographs that seemed to chronicle decades of academy life. The walls told stories of individual achievement and collective celebration in ways that had no parallel in Zephyrian military installations. "Please sit down, Commander," Morrison said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I hope you don't mind, but I've asked Major Harrison to join us. He's been your primary escort, and I value his observations." As Harrison entered and took a seat, Kethvar found himself facing two humans whose bearing and demeanor challenged every assumption he had made about military leadership. Unlike Zephyrian commanders who maintained their authority through intimidation and displays of superiority, these officers projected confidence through competence and earned respect. "You've been with us for 5 days now," Morrison began, "and I'm curious about your impressions. What have you observed that differs from your expectations?" The question was direct but not aggressive, posed with genuine curiosity rather than defensive challenge. Kethvar found himself appreciating the approach while simultaneously struggling with how to respond honestly without giving offense. "Your methods are unconventional," he said carefully. "Your training emphasizes cooperation over competition, adaptation over doctrine, and principles over efficiency. From a Zephyrian perspective, many of your approaches seem counterproductive." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair assessment. May I ask what you find most troubling about our methods?" The directness of the question caught Kethvar off guard. He had expected diplomatic deflection or defensive justification, not genuine interest in his criticism. You deliberately maintain weak elements within your force structure, he said, deciding on honesty. You waste resources supporting personnel who cannot meet basic standards. You encourage questioning of authority that undermines command efficiency. Most significantly, you risk many to save few, which violates fundamental principles of strategic resource allocation. Rather than taking offense, Morrison leaned back in her chair with what appeared to be satisfaction. Excellent observations. You've identified exactly the aspects of our system that seem most paradoxical to external observers. Now let me ask you this. Despite all those apparent weaknesses, how would you assess the actual performance of the cadets you've observed? The question forced Kethvar to confront something he had been trying to avoid acknowledging. Despite their obvious individual limitations and seemingly inefficient methods, the human cadets had consistently demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his expectations. Their performance has been adequate, he admitted reluctantly. Their coordination and adaptability are impressive, and their determination appears to be exceptional. However, these qualities could presumably be achieved through more efficient means. Harrison spoke for the first time since entering the room. Could they, though? Commander, in your military experience, how often have you encountered forces that maintained effectiveness when facing overwhelming disadvantages? The question struck at the heart of Kethvar's growing unease. Zephyrian forces had never been tested against overwhelming disadvantages because they had never faced opponents capable of creating such conditions. Their entire military doctrine was based on ensuring superiority before engaging enemies. The Zephyrian Empire ensures adequate resources for all military operations, he replied. We do not engage enemies under unfavorable conditions. But what if you couldn't avoid unfavorable conditions? Morrison pressed gently. What if you encountered an enemy who couldn't be overwhelmed through conventional superiority? What if your forces were cut off from support, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing impossible odds? The questions touched on scenarios that Kethvar had never been trained to consider. Situations that Zephyrian military doctrine assumed would never arise. Yet as he thought about what he had observed at the academy, he realized these humans were explicitly preparing for exactly such scenarios. You train your forces to fight wars they cannot win, he said slowly. Morrison's expression grew serious. We train our forces to fight wars that must be won regardless of the odds. There's a difference, Commander. When you're fighting for survival, for the preservation of everything you value, defeat isn't an option even when victory seems impossible. She stood and walked to a large map mounted on one wall, pointing to various locations marked with small pins. Every pin on this map represents a battle where human forces achieved victory despite overwhelming disadvantages. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off hundreds of thousands. The Alamo, where a handful of defenders fought to the last man to buy time for their cause. Baston, where surrounded forces held out against impossible odds until relief arrived. Kethvar studied the map, noting the vast number of pins scattered across Earth's geography. These were strategic victories. Most were strategic defeats, Morrison admitted. The defenders were killed or captured, their immediate objectives failed. That they accomplished something more important than tactical victory. They demonstrated that some principles are worth dying for, that some causes justify any sacrifice. Harrison joined them at the map. Commander, what do you think motivates someone to fight when fighting is hopeless? What enables ordinary people to continue resisting when resistance seems futile? The questions forced Kethvar to confront the fundamental difference between human and Zephyrian military philosophy. His species fought for dominance, for conquest, for the expansion of imperial power. These were logical, achievable objectives that justified military action. But humans seemed to fight for abstract concepts that couldn't be captured or conquered. I do not understand what they were fighting for, he admitted. Morrison returned to her desk and retrieved a worn book, handing it to Kethvar. This is our honor code. Every cadet learns it, lives by it, and graduates with the obligation to uphold it throughout their career. Kethvar opened the book and read the simple words that appeared on the first page. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. The simplicity was deceptive. As he read further, he discovered layers of interpretation and application that transformed these basic principles into a comprehensive philosophy of service. This is what they were fighting for, Morrison explained. Not territory or resources or imperial glory, but the preservation of principles that define who we are as a people. When you're fighting for ideas rather than objects, defeat becomes impossible as long as someone survives to carry those ideas forward. The concept was so foreign to Cathvar's experience that he struggled to process its implications. In Zephyrian culture, military action served practical objectives: the acquisition of resources, the elimination of threats, the expansion of control. The idea of fighting for abstract principles seemed inefficient at best, delusional at worst. But principles cannot be defended through military action, he argued. Ideas exist independently of the forces that support them. Morrison smiled. Do they? Commander, what happens to principles when no one is willing to sacrifice for them? What happens to ideas when everyone who believes in them chooses survival over commitment? She gestured toward the window, where cadets could be seen crossing the courtyard in small groups, heading to afternoon classes. Those young people you've observed this week, they're not training to conquer other peoples or expand our territory. They're training to preserve something precious that exists nowhere else in the universe. What is that? The idea that individual lives have inherent value, Harrison said quietly. The belief that people should be free to choose their own destinies. The conviction that justice matters more than power, that truth matters more than convenience, that some things are worth dying for even when dying serves no practical purpose. Kefvar found himself studying the cadets outside with new understanding. What he had interpreted as inefficiency and idealistic delusion was actually something far more complex, a systematic preparation for defending concepts that had no physical form, but which these humans considered more valuable than their own lives. You train them to be willing to die for abstractions, he said. We train them to be willing to live for principles, Morrison corrected. Death is sometimes the consequence of that commitment, but it's not the objective. The objective is to preserve and protect what makes life worth living. She walked to another display case containing artifacts from Academy history. Medals, weapons, photographs, and personal items donated by graduates throughout the centuries. Every item in this case tells a story of someone who chose duty over safety, principle over convenience, service over self-interest. Not because they wanted to die, but because they wanted the ideas they served to live. As Kethvar examined the artifacts, Morrison continued her explanation. This is why we maintain weak elements in our force structure, as you put it. Because our strength doesn't come from eliminating weakness, it comes from protecting it. We're not trying to create perfect warriors. We're trying to create people who will fight to protect imperfect ones. The alien commander found himself confronted with a military philosophy that inverted everything he had been taught. Instead of eliminating weakness to create strength, humans preserved weakness as something worth being strong for. Instead of seeking advantage to ensure victory, they prepared to fight without advantage for causes that transcended tactical considerations. This is why we spend resources rescuing single individuals, Harrison added, apparently reading Kethvar's thoughts. Because the moment we start calculating the value of individual lives in strategic terms, we've lost the very thing we're fighting to preserve.
Morrison returned to her seat and leaned forward intently.
Commander, I'm going to share something with you that we don't discuss with most visitors. Our intelligence services are aware that the Zephyrian Empire is considering military action against the Terran coalition. Kethvar's composure cracked for the first time since his arrival. Intelligence regarding Imperial military planning was among the most closely guarded secrets in known space. The fact that humans had somehow obtained such information suggested capabilities far beyond what they had revealed. I cannot comment on Imperial strategic considerations, he said carefully. I'm not asking you to, Morrison replied. I'm telling you why we invited you here. We wanted you to understand what you would be fighting against if your empire chooses that path. She stood again and walked to the window overlooking the plain, where cadets continued their daily activities in apparent ignorance of the galactic implications being discussed above their heads. Your empire conquers worlds by overwhelming their defensive capabilities and imposing your will on their populations. It's an effective strategy that has served you well across 17 star systems. But Commander, what happens when you encounter a population that won't stop fighting even after you've defeated their military forces? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Kethvar to consider scenarios his training had never addressed. What did happen when overwhelming force failed to produce submission? What did an occupying army do with a population that refused to accept defeat? You believe your people would continue to resist after military defeat? He asked. Morrison turned back to him with an expression that was both sad and determined. Commander, I guarantee it. Every cadet you've observed this week, every graduate of this academy now serving throughout our space forces, they've been trained to view surrender as a temporary tactical setback, not a permanent strategic defeat. They've been taught that as long as one person remains willing to fight for what we believe in, the war continues. Harrison nodded in agreement. We've studied your previous conquests, Commander. You've always faced opponents who fought for territory, resources, or political control. Once you eliminated their governments and occupied their strategic assets, resistance collapsed because the rational basis for fighting disappeared. But we're not fighting for rational objectives, Morrison continued. We're fighting for the right to exist as free people, making our own choices. That right doesn't disappear when you destroy our fleets or occupy our planets. It exists as long as anyone remembers what freedom means and is willing to sacrifice for it. Kethvar found himself grappling with concepts that challenged not just military doctrine, but his understanding of rational behavior itself. The humans were describing a form of warfare that transcended conventional strategic considerations, a conflict that couldn't be won through the application of superior force because the objectives weren't physical. You would sacrifice everything for abstract principles, he asked. We would sacrifice everything to preserve the right to choose our own principles. Morrison corrected. That's what freedom means, Commander. Not the absence of conflict, but the preservation of choice even in the face of overwhelming odds. The meeting continued for another hour, with Morrison and Harrison explaining aspects of human military culture that had been invisible to external observation. They described training programs that prepared officers not just for conventional warfare, but for resistance operations, guerrilla tactics, and the psychological challenges of long-term occupation. They outlined strategies for maintaining civilian morale under impossible conditions, for preserving cultural continuity across generations of conflict, and for turning every defeat into preparation for eventual victory. Most remarkably, they did all of this without hostility or aggressive posturing. They weren't threatening the Zephyrian Empire or attempting to intimidate Kethvar. They were simply explaining, with calm professionalism, what Imperial forces would face if they chose to wage war against humanity. As the meeting concluded and Kethvar prepared to return to his quarters for a final evening at the Academy, Morrison offered one last observation that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Commander, your empire has conquered 17 star systems by being stronger than your enemies. But strength,